Greetings and welcome. We are in our 1010 class. This is the meeting number 10 for June the 20th. And we now want to go through some observations. I recommend some notes for you. We'll then review our cover sheet for meeting 10 and our work, of course, coming up for 11. We only have 3 sessions remaining. And that seems somewhat strange to say out loud, and yet true. So let's talk through it. First of all, just logistics to make sure. And I know that I kind of said this already once before, but I want to be sure that I say it again to you. Just logistics. Let's make sure, please, on your assignment papers that you are telling me what chapter and what assignment is due. Okay? So in other words, for the work of this evening, chapter 9. Look at it now with me, okay? You can handwrite this in. It's okay. Chapter 9 this evening, speculating about causes. Those words should be in your login information so that you're telling me what the assigned topic is. Depending upon the formal paper number 3 that you'll be handing in to me this evening, whether it's chapter 6 or chapter 7, make sure in your login information you identify what chapter 6 or 7 and what the assigned chapter was for either one of those two. Okay. Do you have any questions for me about that? Let's talk MLA real quickly. We're getting better. We're getting better. It's starting to show. It's starting to become clear to me that you're looking closer at what you're doing with in-text citation and end-text citation works cited page. However, we need to make sure, I gotta reiterate this one more time. You want to make sure you have an author's name associated with the work that you are presenting and citing, unless you're working with a verifiable or acceptable institution that would represent your research. Now, this is becoming, as I said in the last conversation with you, this is becoming more hypercritical for us simply because of the ubiquitous nature of the way in which information can be posted to the net and to databases and et cetera, et cetera. So, paying close attention to your reference page continues to matter. One further comment about your reference page. Go ahead and look at that. What is it? 778? Did I say that right? Let's just look in your book for a second at that page. And I'm saying that without a recollection. I did say it right. 778. Go ahead and look at that real quickly. I want to make clear you understand the formatting of all ensuing lines of an entry. So notice, for example, on 778, every time we have a second or third line of an individual entry, we want to indent far enough so that we are able to see cleanly the names associated on the works cited page. Do you see that? So you want to make sure that you're indenting far enough that you've got a clean view. I'm again looking at 778 for this intel. Okay? Questions about any of that? Okay. Let's talk real quickly about setting up the quote. So now we're going to want to write this down. Setting up the quote. This is what young writers will often do that we want to try to avoid. They are writing their paper. They have a quote. They need to, let's say our paper topic is the moon is made of cheese, and they have found Dr. Robinson who says the moon is made of cheese. Got me? They now have the quote. And they will just put the quote into the paper without, now I'm going to use this term again, setting up the quote. Now, what do I mean by that term? You got any sense of what I mean, Bryce, when I say setting up the quote? What does that mean?
Dr. Robinson explains.
You got it. I'm going to set up, or I'm going to prepare the actual quote by giving some kind of language that will precede the quote. So put a note to yourself. You never, ever want to just quote something without saying something about where it comes, who is saying it, how it's germane or particular to the argument that you're making, etc. Then, finishing the quote. By that we mean, after the quote, we always want to make some reference to the quote referencing back to either the thesis or the topic sentence to which we're working from. In other words, a way we say this is, a quote doth not a POV make. Do you understand what I mean when I say that? A quote doth not a POV make. In other words, just because you quote something, don't work off of the assumption, even if it's as clear as your thesis is the moon is made of cheese, and you've literally got a quote by Dr. Robinson, the moon is made of cheese, you still want to explain why this quote matters to your topic. This is especially true because most of the time, quite frankly, our quotes are not the moon is made of cheese. There's subtlety to it, right? There's interpretation quality to it. And we want to make sure we do our work of interpreting whatever quote to finish then the information, okay? So we're always working backwards to our topic sentences and then to our thesis. Finally, to remind, you want to make sure that you're developing your ideas in your paper from one POV to the next by integrating those ideas. You should be making some reference in POV 2 to POV 1. Right? Should go together. Okay? You should be making some reference in POV 3 to what you've said in POV 2. And that can literally be a verbatim reference. This idea is similar to the idea expressed earlier above, right? Blah, 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 blah. So that you're bringing ideas and concepts together. This is what we call writing with power. By that we mean the following. When you write with power, you begin from a position of confidence when you're writing. Okay? So you want to present your ideas with force. Obviously, one of the questions you want to ask is, for yourself compositionally, do I begin with my strongest idea and then work to my weakest? Or do I begin with my weakest idea and work to my strongest? By the way, which do you think is normally the protocol that is suggested? Working from weak to strong or from strong to weak? Consider the issue of the acrimonious audience. If you're writing, yeah, it would make sense. Bryce says it would make sense. If you're considering the weakest, or the acrimonious audience, who's going to naturally agree? Mr. Overcast says, let's go weak to strongest. But now I'm going to ask you why. Why would you think, if the challenge is to keep the acrimonious reader reading, why would we not want to then begin with the knockdown argument, the bat to the face argument? Why would we begin with a weaker argument, rhetorically speaking?
You want to make an impact.
Right. So you're building that argument and that impact towards the end of your paper. If you lead with your strongest argument, your acrimonious reader might just stop reading. You know what I mean? In other words, feel too affronted. Okay? So for example, if I'm taking the thesis that abortion is wrong, I'm not going to lead with abortion is murder. Does that make sense? Right? No. Of course, if you're writing to people who agree with it, they're not going to be like, yay, abortion's murder, you're right, right? But remember, you're not writing to that audience. You're writing to the audience that says abortion is acceptable and okay. That audience is the audience you're writing to. Remember, you're assuming the acrimonious audience. So you want to begin with a premise that is for you not as strong as the final argument. So you're kind of leading. So to give some thought to the presentation of validation in this regards. Okay? Questions, comments, observations, concerns. Of course, as I said before, finding good proofers. Dude, if you're constantly making the agreement problem, then you need to look for agreement issues in the papers you're handing in. If I'm making a reference to a comma splice issue or run-on sentence issue, then clearly those are the kinds of grammatical errors that you really want to be focusing on. I really recommend, if you're not doing it, put a note to yourself, an X on the back of your hand, whatever. Go to paperrater.com and at least put your paper through it. Raise the bar if PaperRater allows you to do it, and I think it does. Raise the bar in terms of the expectation. Go ahead and even say that this is a graduate level paper that you're submitting, and then it will read it even more harshly for you. And that's what you want, okay? Allow for them to find your errors, your mistakes. That's not to say PaperRater finds all of them. And telemetric scoring, as we know from our experience with MyAccess, is not always, the greatest. But anything you can do that can help you to find mistakes and the like, I recommend that you do it. All right, let's review now quickly the review meeting notes for our cover sheet of tonight, meeting 10. We'll have 2 packets this evening that will not go together. 2 packets. You should be looking at your cover sheets now. Make sure that this intel is there in this order. You should have Grammar Chapter 9 notes, followed by your page 695 to 792 notes. Again, all of that is bullet pointed. You should have your teaching company lectures of 19, 20, and 21. I will be giving the topic to that momentarily. And then finally, your Chapter 9 paper, speculating about causes, especially in regards to the 5 required pieces of external validation. Again, just to remind, mark your pieces of external validation in red ink to correlate with your reference page. And again, you want to do that here at the end of the session. I would recommend not now, because you want to pay attention to the other work we're reviewing now. The other thing you're going to hand in this evening is your final formal paper number 3 with your Chapter 6 and or 7. Also marking your 5 pieces of external validation, again in red ink, to make sure that it's done. We are nearing the end, and for those of you who are looking for an A or a B in the class, as I said last week, it's now really critical that you are following explicitly the MLA style book. For me to give you the A or the B, I've got to see that you know how to do that, so that's important. Let's review now the meeting 11, June 5 cover sheet. So let's do that now together. There will just be 1 packet for next week, Tuesday's meeting. And then there were some questions, 1 or 2 of you emailed to me about the final that will happen a week from tonight, Thursday. We'll talk about that one as well here in a second, okay? Just so you kind of know what you're looking forward to. Is that the right phrase, looking forward to? Expecting, dreading, well, whatever the verb is for you. Okay, I'll leave it to you. First of all, for the meeting 11 work of next week, Chapter 10 notes. I'll say this, then I'll explain it. So you just want to write it down, then you'll understand. Chapter 10 notes, and your annotations here, other than the obvious bullet pointing of just taking notes, the Chapter 10 notes will assume the 3 levels of reading annotation. The 3 levels of reading annotation. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. Like I said, you're just going to want to write it down, and then I'll explain it. Your teaching company lectures for Tuesday will finish the series of 22, 23, and 24. Your Chapter 10 paper, let's take a look at it now, will be from page 543 with your 5 pieces of external validation. However, if you'll look real quickly at 543, you can see that we are writing the interpretive essay, the literary interpretive essay, and that's what we call it. It's a lit interp essay. Now, what exactly is a lit interp essay? Notice I'm reading with you on 543. I recommend you're looking at it with me now in the book. You're going to write an essay interpreting some aspect of a short story. You're going to aim to convince readers that your view of the story is interesting, adds to the ongoing conversation among those who read the story and write about them. Okay? You're going to obviously back up your interpretations with reasons and supports from the story, and then of course we are adding the requirement of external validation to the 5 pieces. Now, I need to make sure that you understand what that assignment really means. Go to page 515 now. That you will need to see. 515, and you'll want to write that down as well. Page 515 is a listing of potential questions, and I am assigning to you the question on 515 from Story of an Hour, number 1. Story of an Hour, number 1. You will be writing your paper on the meaning of the final paragraph, okay? The meaning of the final paragraph. So your assigned thesis is to address the final paragraph of Story of an Hour. Okay? Now let's talk validation real quickly. When we're validating for a lit interp paper, and this will sound familiar to you if you've just finished high school lit classes, you'll have 2 kinds of validation. One is what we call internal validation. That validation drawn from the actual text of the story. In this case, K. Chopin's Story of an Hour. Okay? The external validation, obviously, you already understand vis-a-vis the MLA style book that you've been working with in terms of external validation. Okay? So, if you make references to this text, and obviously you want to, story of an hour in your paper, and you quote and or paraphrase, you're obviously doing what we call internal validation. Now, because you will mention in your intro paragraph that you are working with Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, you do not have to, in the body of your paper, provide the author's last name in parenthetics, blah, blah, blah. You don't got to do any of that because it's understood you're treating Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. Put a note to yourself. Make sure in your academic title, in parentheses, Kate Chopin's name is there, Story of an Hour is there. Okay? What would be a sample academic essay topic for this assignment? An analysis of what? How would you say it? An analysis of?
That story.
But specifically, try to be as specific as you can, given the topic of this question. An analysis of? You start with actually the specifics in regards to what you have to do with Story of an Hour. An analysis of? Good. The final paragraph, an interpretive analysis. We might even say it that way. An interpretive literary analysis of the final paragraph of Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. How are we going to identify Story of an Hour in the entire paper? Italicize. That's the simple way to do it. Italicize, then you've got to worry about whether it's quotation marked or underlined. Okay? That way you do not underline it or put quotation marks around it if it's italicized. Alright? Then you're going to write an intro paragraph where you're going to follow that skeleton guide. You're going to introduce the story, Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. You're going to introduce Chopin. You're going to talk about the final paragraph of the story. And then you're going to finally get to your thesis. There are 3 important ideas, contiguous or related to the final paragraph of Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour. Then your topic sentences will address what those 3 are. So you're at least looking at 3 things that are of importance from the final paragraph of Story of an Hour. Of course, if you're already familiar with that story by virtue of studying it in your junior year at the high school level in your American Lit class, that can be of some value to you. Obviously, if this is a new story to you, it's no worries. I mean, it's a very brief story. You can read it, and you can begin the interpretive process. Questions, comments? Finally, let's talk real quickly then about what will happen on our final then. So look at your course outline real quickly. So what exactly is going on with this final session, meeting 12 on June 27? You're going to hand in your final formal paper number 4. That one will either be Chapter 8 or Chapter 9 paper with your 5 references of external validation. Okay? That you'll hand in at the top of the hour. The other thing you'll do is to write a final in class. The final in class will cover one of the stories from Chapter 10. You don't know which one. Where you will write a literary paper, and you'll just do it in class. That paper will not, underline the word, will not involve any external validation. Got me? So you will not have to worry about MLA style book or a works cited page or anything like that. Okay? All you'll do is have to write about the story. To write about the story well, you will need to have kind of read the story and know the story. With that in mind, let's now turn to the annotations of packet number meeting 11, for next Tuesday. And let's talk real quickly about the stories that you will be annotating for next Tuesday. Those stories begin on page 516. Look at it with me now. You will have the Story of an Hour. I'd write these stories down to make sure that you know that you've got them. You will have Kate Chopin's Story of an Hour, starting on 516. You will have the Bell Kaufman Offering Sunday in the Park on 518. You will have William Carlos Williams' story, The Use of Force, on 521. That one's a little bit longer. You'll have the DeLillo short story videotape on 524. And you'll have the classic James Joyce's Araby on 527. Okay? And that one ends over on page 531. Okay? Now, starting on 532, and I'm telling you this in advance so that you do not annotate it with a paragraph annotation or anything like that. Starting on 532, they will give you an example of a literary critique paper. I highly recommend that you read that essay on 532, and then I highly recommend that you read the one on 536 as well. It's another example of how to write an interpretive essay. Do you understand? But you're not treating that like you have been treating these other essays in the other chapters as necessarily as a model. Do you understand what I'm saying? Don't treat it that way, but definitely read it to get a sense of how they interpret the text that they are evaluating. Because you've got to do the same thing. You've got to do it both with Story of an Hour, and then you'll have to do it with one of the stories from chapter 10. Now I'm ready to give a little mini lecture, short lecture, on the annotations that I'm expecting for next Tuesday. So now you want to draw a little line in your notes or whatever, and we're ready to go to that. After you finish, for most of you at least, with the degrees that you're pursuing, after you finish your 1010 class with at least a C or higher, you are then obligated to take, most of you for your programs, what is referenced as the 1020 class. Now the 1020 class is a lit course. It is not a writing course per se, it's a literature course where you're expected to do basically the same thing you did through your high school English classes. You have to read literary texts, you have to respond to them in any number of ways. Sometimes that's exams that are multiple choice, true, false, blah, 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 essays, whatever. And then as well, you sometimes have to write papers and the like. I said sometimes, almost always in the 1020 class, you have to write these papers of literary interpretation or evaluation. The exact same paper that you're having to write for chapter 10. I think this will make sense to you. Chapters 1 and 2 were kind of those reflective essays. Then we started with the paper 3 up through the paper of tonight that you're handing in. And those are kind of academic essays that are particular to the different kinds of course offerings that you would be responsible for, psychology, history, whatever. When you take the 1020 class, that's a very particular kind of study with a very particular kind of paper, and that's the paper of chapter 10. Do you got me? And the idea is we're trying to get you ready for all of the different kind of writing that you will see at the college university level, including the 1020 class. With that in mind, your annotations for literary texts is a little bit different from the kind of annotations that you've been taking to this point. In those kind of annotations, you're looking to read on 3 levels. So we want to write these down as the 3 levels of reading. And as you annotate each one of these stories, you want to give some consideration to each of those 3. Now, if you've studied with me personally already, you know that this kind of 3-level approach has been taught to you in an annotative process that I'm now just going to briefly outline. If you need more thorough information here, go to the archived information on Learn Strong under the 1010 class, and there's a more thorough interpretation or introduction to this. You can look under the Lit folder in the archives for 1010 in the 1020 information that I've actually already provided previous sessions, and you can watch this in more detail. All right, what are these 3 levels of reading that we're responding to? 3 questions, basically. Level 1 asks you to answer the question, what does the text say? Level 1 reading of a text is what we would call simply summative. The French word is a précis. You are providing a summary that's simply bullet points. What happens? First this happens, then this happens, then this happens. Because you're reading short stories, we would qualify that as simply the word plot. Maybe some of you are familiar with that word. If you take a 1020 class, you'll be taught again the whole notion of plot. First this happens, then this happens, then this happens. You're simply summarizing the stories. You're mentioning as well characters' names, things like that. So that in the final, if I asked you to write on a story and I tell you no use of text, no use of notes, you'll at least be able to remember who the people were, for example, in the story Araby or whatever. Okay? Level 2 asks the question, what does the text mean? Now that's a different kind of question from what does the text say. What does the text mean? Asks that you look for messages and themes. It also asks you to look at the rhetorical techniques that are used. Rhetoric, R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C. The rhetorical techniques. Not what the author says, but how the author says it. So for example, you go 4 lines into James Joyce's Araby, and you immediately recognize that he is playing a game of dialect. You are reading English, but you are reading Irish English. Okay? And so right away, you'll realize that, oh, this language is a little bit different. They don't sound like they're from South Alabama. They sound like they're from somewhere else. That can make reading that story a little bit different for you. Got me? If you're picking up a poem and you immediately identify 14 lines, you know that you're looking at a sonnet, right? And so right away, that's a level 2 observation. Now, often in my instruction, I will divide level 2 up into 2A and 2B. 2A, themes, messages. 2B, rhetoric, literary techniques, that kind of thing, okay? What I would say that you want to pay attention to, if you're going to divide it that way at 2B, with short stories, is always 2 things. 1, pay attention to the issue of conflict. What is the source of the conflict? Remember, we can have both internal as well as external conflict, right, in a story. What kind of conflicts do we see? Identify. And then, of course, the second has to do with the issue of the climax of the story, the conflict brought to its ultimate fruition, right? And I'm kind of working off of the assumption that you have exited a high school program, or soon will, where you have been instructed, at least in the basics of how to look at a literary text, level 3. If the first level asks, what does the text say? And the second level asks, what does the text mean? The third level of reading asks, how can I relate this text to either other texts I'm familiar with or to myself, my own situation? Here, you're always wanting to try to think about the potentiality of a prof in a 10-20 class, not just asking you to write on, for example, Story of an Hour, but also maybe asking you to write on a comparative analysis between Story of an Hour and James Joyce's Araby. In other words, choose a common theme. Both of those stories can be identified with go to work, ready, go. Now, it makes sense in advance that you start thinking about the relationship of text to text. So let me make a suggestion to you. In your notes for chapter 10, relate every story to every other story, which you really can't do until you finish reading up through James Joyce's Araby, right? So once you've read, 4 or 5 of those stories? Is it 5? Would you write? You write down 5? So there's 5 of these stories. And so what I would recommend at level 3 that you do is just write a couple of lines about how each one of those stories relates to the story that you're doing the annotation over, right? So you might want to wait for level 3 until you finish reading all 5 stories, and then just go back and ask, okay, if the Looney asked me to write in the final on a comparative analysis between Story of an Hour and Sunday in the Park, for example, can I do that? I mean, is there any relationship I can see between those two? Okay? It will help you in preparing for the exam if you've already begun to think about that. Okay? Because oftentimes in a 10-20 class, the timed writing is timed. In other words, you're only given 45 minutes, and you have to produce a 5-paragraph essay or more in that amount of time, that allotted amount of time. Okay? I would say coming in here, come in prepared to write a timed writing without the use of the text and without the use of your notes. Okay? That way, if the instructor happens to feel generous that evening and give you the right to use the text and the notes, you'll be relieved, but you'll be like, I could have done it without it. See what I'm saying? As opposed to, I got to have the text in front of me to write, and if the instructor says no text, now all of a sudden you're kind of poop out of luck. Okay? Any questions about what we're doing with the 3 levels of reading? Finally, if you want to, you can make some personal reference to the text. We know from cognitive research that if you can make a personal reference to a text, you actually remember that text far longer than if you don't. So putting some kind of personal spin on the story, either you've been in a situation like this, or somebody who has, or you could think about a movie or something that you saw once, something that you can jot down that helps you to remember. So for each one of those 5 texts, you're going to have 5 sheets of paper. And you're just going to have some notes that work at levels 1, 2, and 3. You're going to identify those 3 levels on the left-hand side of the page by just writing level 1, level 2, level 3. Okay? And then you'll just write some notes in. And again, it's all just bullet-pointed information. Now, I'm not going to be real stickler about this because obviously this isn't a 10-20 class. But it at least gives you a sense of what you're doing when you are working, taking notes in a 1020 offering. Okay? This question has been raised, so I will address it, however. The 1020 class, is that a class that you teach in the summer, Mr. McGee? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, sometimes we've done it in the summer contemporaneously with this class. So, for example, it's a Monday, Wednesday offering, as opposed to a Tuesday, Thursday offering for my 1010. The plan as it now stands is for me to offer the 1020 class next June, just like I did this one in 2014. So for those of you who are thinking about maybe do I want to take the 1020 class in the summertime, it will be available. At least that's our tentative understanding, okay? Contingent on budgets and the like. So what I would say is that might not be a bad idea. That's at least one place it can be offered. Sometimes it's also offered in the evenings for me during the normal year, but if that happens, it's almost always in the spring, never in the fall. Okay? Question?
Are you going to do another 10-10 class?
In the next summer?
Or just one?
Yeah, I always have the offering of a 10-10, I say always, normally in the 10-10 offering is in the fall, and then I also always have it in June, just like I've done it for you guys. Yeah, that's normally. The only reason why that wouldn't happen is if my traveling schedule doesn't allow it, and that's always kind of, negotiated in the months of January and February. Okay? All right? Questions, comments? Okay, let's take out 3 blank sheets of paper then.